Good afternoon, everyone. You are watching the special luncheon dialogue envisioning China, Africa's trade and investment at the China-Africa Conference, LSE 2021. My name is Shirley Yu, Director of the China-Africa Initiative at the LSE. And joining us today are some of the world's most authoritative and leading minds on Africa and the global development. We are greatly honored to welcome Her Excellency, Dr. Rania Al-Mashat, Minister of International Cooperation, Egypt. She's one of the most powerful women on the global stage and indeed an inspiration for females all around the world. And we also have the senior leadership from our leading global development institutions joining us. We have Jing Donghua, Vice President and Treasurer of the World Bank, Leslie Mastrop, CFO of the New Development Bank, who is just waiting to check in here, Dr. Martin Kimmick, Chief Risk Officer of Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And so before we get started, we just would like to welcome and invite you to please write your comments and questions on our social media platforms and our distinguished speakers. So first of all, I would love to start with a question for you, Your Excellency. You did mention on CNBC a couple of weeks ago that multilateralism is alive and thriving. Now, today, our lineup of speakers absolutely represent that spirit of global multilateralism. But in 2021, things seems to have changed a bit. The understanding of globalization has shifted. And so is multilateralism today in 2021 still taking on the same characteristics as before? Are there any new architectures on the horizon that we are looking at?
Thank you very much, Shirley, and thank you for your kind introduction. As I was mentioning earlier, at the beginning of 2020, we entered the pandemic with protectionism, a trade war, the geopolitics changing, and then all of us were hit with a pandemic that initially sort of created a rhetoric that every country is on its own, no exports, the supply chains being cut off. But very soon after, everybody realized that to get out of this global problem, we had to work together. So in my view, no, there is scope and space for multilateralism. It's inevitable, notwithstanding the challenges that we face, particularly given the very fastly evolving geopolitical developments that are taking place. Nonetheless, when we talk about different countries having national agendas towards 2030, they are able to fulfill this with a lot of cooperation with multilateral institutions as well as with bilateral development partners. In our case, this has continued in 2020 and through 2021 in a very robust manner. And that's what gives me confidence that, no, there is multilateralism. We work together. We have whether it's inclusive, digital, or green as national strategies, every country that's able to fulfill this in collaboration with its development partners adds to the global agenda.
Right. Very interestingly, Dr. Rania, you mentioned about achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Every country, rich or poor, are in this goal together, and we are 9 years away to achieving those stated goals. What currently represent the biggest challenges in Africa?
Of course, when we take a look at Africa, the infrastructure is an issue. Infrastructure related to digital. Today, everything that is taking place and the pandemic has shown us how countries are resilient depending on or a function of their readiness on the digital platforms. So I think that is a very key challenge. The other is, of course, the younger population, and that younger population needs more jobs and therefore more private sector engagement. So these are, and private sector engagement comes through different types of financing, whether it's trade financing or ODA financing, which comes at low cost, but readdressing the risk premia for many of the countries in Africa might be one venue where we can all coordinate on, particularly given the potential of the continent and how it can provide a lot of value added to the global community.
And Jingdong, you earlier mentioned that it's very important for Africa's sustainability to essentially create a vibrant private sector in Africa. So you are very passionate about working in and around Africa's development for the past 3+ decades. So what are the things that the World Bank, as well as other multilateral institutions, are doing today with African governments to ensure job creations, the private sector generation, and the delivering the transparency of the corporate governance to ensure the corporate sector's sustainability?
Well, thank you, Shirley, and certainly delighted to be on the same panel with Honorable Minister and my colleagues from AIIB and New Development Bank. So maybe just before I answer that question, we are still in the middle of a global pandemic, which itself is an indication that without multilateralism, each individual country would be absolutely in despair in terms of overcoming, the global effort of COVAX, the sharing of vaccines so that we can accelerate access to vaccines so that the world can get out of this is certainly a great effort and true demonstration of value of multilateralism. When it comes to Africa, there are quite a number of things in terms of how do we make sure that Africa is attractive to private investors, both within the continent, but also from abroad. Now, I used to be at IC, and so is my good friend, Dr. Kimmick. But now I'm at the World Bank side. I very much appreciate the policy advice the World Bank has been working on with governments in terms of creating that enabling environment. And since the Honorable Minister is here, one great project we did together, and certainly IIB was involved, is the Egyptian solar project, where through the partnership between the World Bank, MIGA, ISC, AIIB, and many private banks, instead of a piecemeal building of renewable energy, one solar farm to another solar farm, instead, I think we work with the government, and certainly Minister played a key role in figuring out how do we tell private investors this is a holistic plan of renewable energy for Egypt. Here is a power purchase agreement that is transparent, that is backed up not only by the government, but by MIGA, by the World Bank. And then private sector sponsors could come pick and choose which solar farm they'd like to work on. That was very successful. And if my memory serves me correct, I think there was 13 solar farms parceled out to a number of private sector sponsors who came in and pick and choose their own. And certainly many commercial banks and AIIB, ISC came in a syndicated loan platform. So, financing was solved. So I think getting private sector interested certainly needs a multi-stakeholder participation, starting with the government, giving private sector the level of confidence, not through words, but through actual policy, through a level of transparency, and certainly Egypt has done it really well.
So talking about this cross-continental multilateral cooperation, particularly in Egypt, is really coincidental. And we have almost every spokesperson on this project here. But Dr. Kimmick, you are sitting in Beijing. You are in the senior leadership of one of the fastest rising global multilateral development institutions. I understand that just recently your institution has come up with the policy that AIIB is no longer going to invest in fossil fuel projects overseas. And I think a lot of these major policies are going to inevitably transform the African sustainable landscape. So from your perspective, in Africa's development, are you doing something different, maybe slightly innovative, a little bit different from what the, say, for example, your counterparts have been doing in Africa?
First, thanks to be on this panel, and hello to Her Excellency. She might not remember it, but I met her at the World Bank meeting in 2019. And obviously, hello to Qingdong and Leslie. So yes, when we started our energy strategy, we started already with a very restrictive use of coal, only in absolute exceptional circumstances when there is no other energy source available. But however, earlier this year, we made the public commitment we will not finance coal. And this is in advance of our new reviewed energy policy. Next question is obviously gas, still a carbon, a source of energy. We see gas as transitionary, and also obviously have criteria where gas is still useful. Also, as we have committed, like the World Bank, IFC has, I'm sure, and the NDB will or has, to be Paris aligned by July 1st, 2023. Also, there will be further restrictions on the use of gas. But real focus is obviously be catalytic with respect to the real green energies. And that is obviously, and I wanted to stress that Paris alignment, achieving the Paris goals can only mean being multilateral and cooperative. And despite all the geopolitical tensions, which have arisen, also over the last 2 years, I think the sensitivity to the climate change risks, which are particularly severe in Africa, have become, I think, made headlines everywhere, whether it's government or even private sectors, which seem to lead governments in many countries. So I'm very optimistic that this is a big area of cooperation. And the project that Qingdong mentioned has taken years in preparation, needed a policy reform to start with. There was personal involvement of Her Excellency that this is going to be delivered, and this indeed was a big success. So we have 103 members today. We have an increasing membership in Africa. Egypt is one of our founding members, and so we obviously have a fast-growing investment program in Egypt, and climate mitigation is a key center stage of what we do, and obviously. In the short term, also we're focusing on crisis response, but going forward, it is one of our stated objectives in Africa, because we do believe that the consequences of climate change in Africa are particularly severe. And if you look at who participated in the DSSI out in Africa, it's 48 countries out of 73. While, objectively debt levels as a percentage of GDP might not be very high, but the ability to endure setbacks is very, very limited because of a very, very small revenue base. Thank you.
So the risk is high as well. So Leslie, you talking about sustainability, you are passionate about it. I'm sorry if because of the Wi-Fi issue, we seem to have missed some of your incredible remarks there. But at New Development Bank, it's really interesting when the people, especially our students, when they hear about New Development Bank, they just think it's something new. But it actually came from your predecessor, is the BRICS Bank, which was originally the BRICS countries partnership in building this multilateral platform. But you have gone way beyond that original BRICS conception, right? So tell us about your ambitions, particularly in Africa, please.
Leslie, you're on mute.
The bank was created in Can you hear me now? The bank was created in 2015. The articles were signed in 2014. At that stage, as you know, there was a growing sentiment amongst the large emerging markets that their voice was not adequately represented in the existing Bretton Woods institutions. So let's be very clear. There was a feeling within the large market, especially within the G20, they used G20 to a degree to try and effect those reforms, but it took a very long time. So these institutions were created. New Development Bank was set up by Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, but the intention has always been to create a new emerging markets focused multilateral institution. So we will now migrate beyond the BRICS countries. We have already started in that regard. The bank has just admitted 3 new members, and the process of admitting new members will now gather momentum. We hope and are very confident that a number of countries from the African continent will also also be joining, and so also Central Asia, Latin America, and so on. So over time, the bank will become a truly global institution. But as I was saying earlier on, there are very unique challenges facing the world right now. And we see ourselves playing a much bigger role in what we would broadly define as the just transition. And by the way, this language is captured in the Paris Agreement on climate change, where it was recognized that there will be winners and losers in this transitions. There are many emerging markets. In fact, let's take Africa. We're talking about energy here. Almost 500 million people in Africa still do not have access to electricity. So forget about the coal debate and the issues around climate change and the concerns about, the global temperatures rising above 2%. We're talking here about day-to-day issues of having access to an important resource like power. Kids cannot study, hospitals cannot function. So as Martin was saying now, we have to make sure that the provision of power is a central objective in the continent. Obviously, there's a lot of large supplies of cheap coal in many countries. How we deal with that is a challenge that multilateral banks have to play a central and leading role in. It's not going to happen magically that all of these coal-fired power stations, let's take South Africa, where I'm from, one province have probably about 70% of the coal-fired power stations, called Mpumalanga in South Africa. So all of those jobs in the coal mines, all of the value chains, those towns, like the deindustrialized towns of the developed world 30, 40 years ago, will become stranded and will have massive issues. So I guess what I'm saying is that we have to tilt our focus to ensure that we deal with what is called the just transition, and we provide the transition finance to ensure that workers are retrained, that those stranded assets are not just left unattended, but that there is a process of readjustment.
Very interestingly, I know Jingdong mentioned earlier in our fireside chat that the world may perhaps does not really fully appreciate the scale of Africa's geography. So essentially, described that if we just drop the United States, Canada, and China all in Africa continent would still be bigger than the three combined. And so now talking about the infrastructure, that's absolutely massive in order to cover that entire continental development there. So one African leader recently, Her Excellency Ruth Kagia, the Deputy Chief of Staff for the President of Kenya, she had a great thought. She said, one thing I would love to recommend to China is actually to go beyond country-specific approach, to take a continental approach in looking at Africa. And infrastructure has to be interregional, isn't it? Are we moving to stage where instead of working with countries, sovereign centers, we are essentially looking at Africa continental development as a whole with a unified approach? Any thoughts there, Jingdong, at the World Bank? I know you probably, there's no bigger authority on China, Africa than you are.
Well, look, I'm the treasurer of the World Bank, so I don't work on the operational side. But that said, Shirley, I think one thing that we are very excited about is the new digital infrastructure. How could it help Africa to leapfrog, right? For example, access to schooling during pandemic, and that exposed the inequality between OECD countries and many countries that don't have Wi-Fi access. And that also has great implication for financial inclusion, for access to finance, so on and so forth. For traditional infrastructure, and definitely, I think China's example of building roads, and not only analyzing the feasibility purely based on the road itself, but the potential positive network effect, right, for commerce, for manufacturing, for logistics, for supply chain, to factor in the broader benefit. I think that could change the economic analysis of whether building infrastructure makes sense or not. Last point I want to make is that definitely, I think when you compare China with Africa, probably the provinces of China in size are similar to many of the countries in Africa. And certainly, highways cannot stop at provincial borders. And many of the poorest provinces in China, like Yunnan, Guizhou, once they were, developing and developing very fast infrastructures, then new engines of economic growth came about. From tourism to exotic fruits that only those regions could produce, to other agricultural products, and therefore it actually really triggered new engines of access. For example, I'll give you one example. In Mauritania, camel milk is something that is quite famous. But I think because of logistic restrictions, that camel milk actually cannot be, exported because of the short period. Once when you don't have cold storage, most of them just go bad. So just imagine if you do have infrastructure built around it, whether it's logistics, cold storage, transportation, that could be, a new source of revenue and new source of private sector investment for the country. Let me just stop there.
So therefore, the network effect is very interesting. So earlier this morning, we had representatives for the president of the African Development Bank at our opening session. And so indeed, it was truly inspirational. In the speech, the African Development Bank's representative talked about if China could move from a low-income country to a higher middle-income country within one generation, then Africa certainly can too. So it's very, very, we see really, truly a very ambitious agenda on the horizon there. So Your Excellency, what are some of the fundamental prerequisites you think Africa needs in order to achieve that sort of grand agenda?
Let me say a few things in the Egyptian context and then the continental or in the continent. The example of Binban solar panel was mentioned. How did that come about? There was a structural reform introduced by the government, the feed-in tariff. So there was a realization that in order to open the potential for a sector, we needed to do a certain regulatory reform, which we did take into account. Once that took place, you were able to mobilize multilateralism in the sense that you had the different multilateral development banks there, you had the private sector. So this is an example. If any country is focused enough, knowing where it needs to push, I believe that that opens the doors. Seriousness, clarity, follow-up, and transparently mentioning what you're doing. So these are things that we have been able to do on a national stage, and this has helped us tremendously. Sorry about that noise. So in our case, for example, the official development assistance portfolio is $25 billion across various sectors. So this is an example. When we talk about African Development Bank and in Africa infrastructure, we have the Cairo-Cape Town road, for instance, is one of the projects that we are endorsing, and it's being done with the African Development Bank. Electricity transmission between Cairo, Southern Sudan, and in Libya. That's another example. So there are these items which are very important when it comes to collaboration within the continent, and IFIs or MDBs are there to lend support once the project is clear. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement is a very important mechanism. We need to create more actions towards it so that we can fulfill its potential. We have a 2063 Africa agenda. So there's the 2030 global, and then there's the Africa 2063. And of course, the Silk Road is another very important initiative. The Belt and Road, which is very, very important. And it also ties in with the Africa 2063 agenda. So there are several items which, if we start activating a little bit more, we will be able to answer many of the questions that you mentioned. So there's so much that can be done. it's impossible to do a big bang approach, but there are, if we push on each of these venues, there is great potential that can be realized.
So what are some of the structural weaknesses or maybe potential for opportunities that you believe that Africa needs to resolve collectively? So some fundamental characterizations of the continent and the economy that to be collectively,
yes. So
I guess,
one of the
or improved upon.
So one of the key challenges for the world is water. And water is an issue because of climate change, because of population growth. And therefore, there are several wastewater management plans that we have done. And many of our private sector companies who implemented those are doing the same in other African countries. So what is important here is because lending to certain African countries has a risk premium, we need to discuss with different development banks how we can bring that down, given the successes that we've seen with certain private sector from the country to be scaled up and replicated in others. I think like we've lost Shirley.
We've lost Shirley there for a moment, but I wanted to add one or two things that I think are really sort of critical for Africa going forward. You touched on some of the fundamentals. I mean, the people often ask whether it is possible to replicate the 40 years of spectacular reform and opening up and this growth miracle that China unleashed over the last 40 years. Could that be replicated in Africa? I've lived in China now for the last 6.5 years, and I've often thought about this issue. And people, often wonder what are the lessons that one can take from this experience. And as His Excellency has just sort of outlined, there are no silver bullets. I mean, obviously, we have to do the basics, which is strengthen the fundamentals that underpin growth, which is investment in people. Ultimately, development is about human capital and building strong institutions. There's things, building a regulatory framework and investment friendly, ease of doing business. All of those things matter, but ultimately, as Jingdong outlined at the beginning, it's really about sustainable development. It's about developing people, human capacity, and developing institutions. So that is a long-term endeavor. We cannot have, elements of a sort of 5 or 10-year sort of strategy, hoping that we can replicate what China has done. I mean, obviously, in the context of the fact that we have multiple countries, we have to look at what is the one or two unique features that all of us share. And the one really most valuable asset that we have are our people. We have the youngest population. We will have the biggest working age population by 2034 in the world. Africa, as you know, will be the size of China and India combined by 2050. In the context of an aging world, this is a most valuable asset. So investment in human capital is at the heart of a rejuvenation strategy for Africa, in my view.
So Leslie, you earlier mentioned the mission of the NDB is essentially to create a multilateral development bank more for the emerging world. I'd love to come back to that point and specifically invite you to address what are some of how does that imply about the principles and the execution of the new development bank today that are slightly perhaps different from the standard understanding of multilateral development? How do you address that new emerging world need?
I mean, I'd say the bank in every respect represents, as I said earlier on, the sort of core architecture of what the other multilateral banks have. However, as I outlined earlier on, there are unique sort of aspirations and there are unique features of developing countries and emerging markets which has to be taken into account. So the way the ownership structure works of the bank, 80% of the equity of the new development bank will always be held by emerging markets. So we will have non-borrowing members, and we hope we will get non-borrowing members in very soon, because we already have one, which is United Arab Emirates, but we hope to get significantly more developed countries in, because these are highly rated countries. They bring very unique additional strengths to the institution. So we're not saying that we're building a exclusive borrowers club, because that is not the intent. However, as I mentioned earlier on, we do want to see what new can we do. Qingdong spoke about the power of technology earlier on. There's an untapped potential in terms of the power of technology. Secondly, as I mentioned, we have unique aspects linked to the transition to low carbon future, and this desire to find a set of strategies to deal with the transitional implications of this move from carbon intensive world towards a low carbon future. We would like to help our countries in that transition journey, because it's a unique set of challenges that the African countries will be facing.
Absolutely interesting. Qingdong is obviously a big believer in innovation, and so I believe is Dr. Kimmick at the AIIB. So from your two gentlemen's perspective, Africa, earlier this morning, our African representatives were talking about essentially Africa seeing this digital transformation as a major global leveling off opportunity for Africa with the developed world in this fourth industrial revolution. And so I believe there were language such as Africa will take a lead or a leadership role in the fourth industrial revolution. So from AIIB and particularly the World Bank's perspectives, how are we supporting the African ambition there in its digital transformation? Dr. Kim, please.
Okay, I can go first. I can go first. Obviously, in the field of infrastructure, digital innovation is playing a major role. For example, when you look at smart grid systems, you look at smart cities, you look at smart transport systems, where the digital transformation does allow you, and Qingdong used the term earlier, to leapfrog. There is an advantage. I don't want to sound arrogant, but there is to that extent also an advantage not having any baggage in terms of old infrastructure that you have to use because you cannot accept sunk costs, and to look at the new wave that is feasible and financeable. But I still want to maybe link a little back to the question earlier, and it doesn't sound very mundane, but implementation capacity, execution is absolutely essential in delivering success of projects. And obviously one of the major differences is if you're in China, it's its execution capabilities. And obviously also in Egypt, this is a very advanced civil society with tremendous execution capabilities. And that is a challenge in some countries. So that's where we lean a lot on the World Bank. We co-finance about a third of all our investments with the World Bank, because the World Bank has local implementation execution capabilities that are important to get the deliveries on ground. Whether it's digital or not digital, we did digital recently in Rwanda with the World Bank to help those small companies to get access to the outside world. We have learned all from M-Pesa, which I believe now is already 15 years ago, which completely leapfrogged the banking system. And I think the same thing we're going to see in logistics and in other areas. Healthcare is a big area where the digital revolution will be a major impact, and obviously education. So I'm very optimistic. We also have challenges around digital. I'm a risk officer. We have a risk of facing a digital divide. And I think as development partners, we have to collaboratively work against that and to have common standards also with respect to digital, with respect to data privacy, that does allow us to collaborate effectively.
Qingdong, you have been working really passionately on the digital transformation. Particularly, you talk quite a lot about Rwanda. So, what are some of the innovative initiatives that we are doing in jumpstarting Africa's digital transformation there?
Yes, Shirley. I think colleagues have talked about the importance of digital quite enough, and certainly that would link to making sure the human capital in Africa gets proper education and they become productive labor forces. And of course, the experience of Kenya is very, very telling, that no matter what is the stage of development, right, if you somehow can make digital access happen, in Kenya, access to finance is now over 90% of the population, one of the highest even in the world. So how do we make sure that we nurture, support similar successes and similar to the Egyptian solar? It is a full value chain from regulatory reform on government policy all the way to having private sector entrepreneurship coming to specific solutions to each part of whether it's remittance, whether it's online banking, whether it's investment. The fact that Kenya Treasury issued the world's first online savings bond. So Kenyan citizens can buy those bonds through cell phone. And this is really the first. So which leads to another story, that is, how do we make sure that we nurture successes within Africa that will serve Earth's motivations? I want to share that Egypt issued one of the earliest green bonds on the continent, 750 million, 5 times oversubscribed. And congratulations, Honorable Minister, that's a great success, right? That is, in addition to ODA support, how do we open Africa so they become attractive to international institutional investors? So I think it's really a multitude of efforts that we have to make. But one thing I wanted to say is that, because we're talking about China, Africa, and China certainly had exceptional growth. But just want to remind your audience that over the past 20 years, in aggregate, Africa was also making rapid progress. Just cite some numbers so that we put things in perspective. The access to electricity 20 years ago was about 26%. Now it's about half of the population. Still a long way to go, but that's good progress. Life expectancy went up 10 years. Primary education completion went from 54% to 69%. And per capita GDP income went from $550 to $15,000, tripling over the past 20 years. So if the same trend continues, including with better infrastructure, better education, a coordinated policy reform, and as Martin said, great execution with good governance, transparency, I'm very optimistic about the future of Africa.
And talking about creating a continental example for the rest of the economies, Your Excellency, Egypt is a highlight of African growth, I should say, particularly post the COVID-19. Egypt was one of the strongest economies in 2020 and it continues in 2021. Your debt to GDP ratio is a little over 90%. How did you do that?
Let me just say that we also need to encourage SouthSouth Cooperation, and that is something that we launched we had a conference 2 weeks ago, the Egypt ICF, International Cooperation Forum, and one of the key highlights was to institutionalize South-South cooperation. So examples, as were mentioned, the green bond or the solar plant, or how we involve the private sector in the big projects that we do with the multilateral development banks, how their capacity has grown. I think there's a way and a need to actually showcase what has worked so that we save time, and also scale up what has worked so that it is easier for those who want to finance. In our case, the 2% growth in 2020, despite everything that was happening around us, came because there's a belief that reform is a continuous process. We started very serious economic reforms on the fiscal and monetary side in 2016. That continued through 2019. Then structural reforms were taking place. So when the pandemic hit, we had enough buffers to get us through. And also we did not do a full lockdown. So there were important steps that we were very preemptive before the pandemic. And that's why in good times or in bad times, you need to reform. And given the dynamism in the world today, the amount of reforms that any government has to do keeps on changing by the day. So you have to be very agile and be able to incorporate this in our policy frameworks. Something else, just to conclude on multilateralism. In 2020, we launched principles of economic diplomacy at the Ministry of International Cooperation to try and actually have stakeholder engagement across our dealings with the international community. So we had multi-stakeholder platforms where the IFIs would be there with line ministries to hear the reform process and what financing needs are needed. Then we did a matching or a mapping of ODA financing to SDGs. So this is very important because every multilateral or bilateral development partner can know their dollar contributes how much to the global agenda. And this, we publicize it on our website, and the methodology can be used by other countries. And then finally, creating a narrative that can be consistent across our multilateral friends. And that is people at the core, because everything we do is for people, projects in action, and purpose as the driver. So these are just some of the elements that we try to reflect on multilateralism, but there's a host of reforms that the government has done to be able to weather this storm and give us the potential, the momentum through 2021, with growth rates expected to be higher than 5%.
That's truly amazing. So before we wrap up, given the limitation of time, we truly hear a much stronger sense, and really is a sense of hope for the revival of global multilateralism and going stronger, particularly in the world's developing regions. And so with that, I would love to, again, ask on behalf of our LSE students a question, because today we have the World Bank, we have the AIIB and the New Development Bank coming out of the emerging world, and we have the world's one of the strongest economies here. So what are some of the advice that you may give to our students and maybe our young audience all over the world, if they were to aspire for a global development career, some sort of career aspirations to follow your footsteps? What are the quintessential qualities that they need to possess today? Maybe we can start with you, Qingdong. Thank you so much for your time.
Certainly, my own journey in multilateralism over the past almost 30 years, certainly I have a fulfilling life where you can achieve your professional goals while also have the sense that you're doing something very meaningful in terms of helping humanity. So for the younger generation, I certainly hope that you will use your creativity, your passion, to find new solutions so that, we can achieve the SDG, have a green and blue planet that is comfortable to live, and certainly something that we look for the next generation to carry the flag, and I'm sure they will do a better job than we do.
That's great. What about you, Martin? Maybe we'll just take a clock.
Oh yeah, I'm sort of a classical career. I'm almost embarrassed. PhD in economics, joined the World Bank as a YP, global fixed income trader, because I found the initial development work a bit too slow and too boring. And then left Treasury to join IFC, the Asian crisis, 98. I think that I would summarize it similar as Qingdong. It's a privilege to work in the profession that is professionally interesting, but allows you to live your values and your vision of the world to have impact. And ultimately, I think you should ask yourself, in a multicultural environment, do you see differences of people as a transaction cost in communication, or do you see it as a spice in life? And if you see it as a spice in life, then these are fantastic environments where you meet many, many interesting people, will start friendships that go way beyond work and discover, commonalities. It's a very unique place.
We can actually see that it's indeed a small world as well. Well, Your Excellency, everybody seems to have a PhD in economics. Is that a quintessential criteria here? Is there we need a variety of global talents, right, in various calibers? What's your advice?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that the key lesson for me has been humility. You know, in order to be able to collaborate with colleagues, I used to be at the IMF as an EP, and then I went back as advisor to the chief economist. I was at the central bank as sub-governor, and then a minister of tourism, and now minister of international cooperation. And I think what is key in any job you take, or in designing an ability to sustain your career, you have to be humble. You have to be humble with those around you. You have to listen very well. You learn from people. Ricardo was correct. There's a comparative advantage, and we all complement one another. And that complementarity is really what I think also defines multilateralism.
And Leslie, what's your advice to the young African students out there?
It's always good to be last, because I can just echo what the previous three speakers have said. But in brief, I mean, I would say that, you know, just imagine yourself what the world would have been like if we faced COVID, each one to his own. And COVID really sort of in that sense demonstrated the value and importance of multilateral institutions. Most of the biggest, most intractable challenges the world face right now, whether it's the pandemic, whether it's climate change, whether the challenge of refugees, none of these things we can sort out just by ourselves in each of our countries. So multilaterals have a very, very important and will become even more important into the future. And as Martin Kimmick has said, you can feel and touch what we do. I spent you know, the better part of my career in Goldman Sachs. I was also vice chairman at Barclays Capital, as well as with the Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, doing mergers, acquisitions, doing traditional corporate finance, if you like. But I find the work so much more fulfilling over the last 6.5 years in multilateral development banking, because we work across borders. We work for future generations. We live our values, as Martin has said.
Well, thank you so much, Your Excellency, and all our fantastic speakers from the best, you know, career examples from our world of development institutions. So today, allow me to thank everyone on behalf of the Feroce Lalji Institute of Africa, and thanking our students for tuning in today. And most importantly, thank you, Your Excellency, Dr. Rania Al-Mashat, Jingdong Hua, Vice President and Treasurer of the World Bank, Leslie Mastrop, CFO of New Development Bank, and Dr. Martin Kimmick, Chief Risk Officer of the AIIB, for joining us today. And I'm sure our students will continue to seek for your inspiration and advice in the years to come. Thank you for your time. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.